You're in quiet transit. Engines are steady. Everything is predictable. Let the story carry you forward slowly and calmly. Nothing urgent, nothing required. The story begins. I remember the graveyard first, not the attack. The carrier hung in the ring like a carcass caught in ice. Not a heroic silhouette, not a clean museum piece. Just mass, scarred plating, old impact craters sealed with welded patches that didn't match the hull color. It had been painted too many times. The new coats never fully covered the old burns. In the gas giant's thin reflected light, the ship looked bruised. Around it, the scrapyard drifted. Stripped habitats, busted cargo frames, shattered antenna trusses, a slow storm of metal that never fell anywhere. The orbit kept everything in a perpetual almost collision. Every object had a path, a number, a predicted near miss. The predictions were never perfect. In the graveyard, you learned to trust your visor and your instincts more than the boards. My suit was older than some of the crew posted here for the ceremony. The left hip joint clicked. The right shoulder servo lagged by half a breath. I had tape over 2 micro leaks in the collar ring, and I could feel the cold where the seal didn't sit clean anymore. Salvage Marine, 3rd Detachment didn't get pristine gear. We got what still held pressure. The decommissioning platform was bolted to the carrier's flank like a parasite. It was meant to turn warships into raw material. It had cranes, torch gantries, pressurized work tunnels, and a civilian observation gallery with thick glass panels where officials could watch the retirement like it was a tradition to be proud of. A ceremony of safety. A ritual of control. We were told it mattered. Once a year, someone came to light the beacon. The memorial station was a small thing compared to the carrier. A truss and a bulb of habitat modules, a transmitter mast, a plaque in a vacuum-rated casing, and a docking collar that had never been used. It sat a few thousand kilometers out, just beyond the densest parts of the ring. It was placed there after the first reef war ended, the one nobody liked to name in public because it implied it could start again. The agreement was simple. The way people make agreements when they don't understand what they fought. Once a year, a human craft would dock with the memorial station, cycle the airlock, and activate the beacon for 1 hour. The opposing side never appeared. Not once in 23 years. The beacon still went on, every year, because that was what you did when you wanted to pretend you had a lever on the universe. This year, they assigned me to escort duty. It wasn't a compliment, it was a precaution. They didn't want a ceremonial officer in a clean suit to be the only one who understood pressure doors and hull stress. They wanted someone who knew how quickly vacuum turned a person into a quiet problem. We launched in a small cutter with a docking nose and a compact ECM suite that hadn't been fired in anger since before I grew the first scar on my jawline. The cutter's interior smelled of sealant and human breath. The pilot didn't talk much. Nobody did. The civilians in the rear compartment had cameras mounted to their helmets and little lights clipped to their chest plates. They were there to record the ritual. I was there to make sure it didn't turn into debris. I watched the memorial station grow in the visor feed, a thin shape against the pale band of the ring. It looked untouched. That should have been comforting. It wasn't. Something that sits alone for decades in a place like this gathers grit. Micrometeoroid pitting, frosting from vented water, a slow drift of dust that clings to seams. The memorial station looked too clean, like it had been scrubbed by something patient. We approached on a controlled vector. The cutter's thrusters puffed in short bursts. The station's docking collar aligned itself with us, its mechanical pedals opening in a slow, obedient bloom. The auto predictor was silent. No collision warnings, no near-miss alarms. The ring around us was too orderly. I marked that thought and put it aside because thoughts don't fix anything, procedures do. We closed to docking distance. The collar locks began to cycle. The pilot's hands were steady on the controls. The civilians' helmet lights trembled faintly. I saw one of them breathing too fast in the suit telemetry overlay, the oxygen draw rising. Then the memorial station vanished. Not exploded, not shattered. It was there, and then it was gone, replaced by a clean plane of drifting fragments that caught the light for a heartbeat like glitter. The docking collar, mid-cycle, was simply not connected to anything anymore. The cutter lurched as the sudden lack of mass changed the microgravity gradients. A faint shudder ran through the hull as debris peppered us in soft impacts. My suit's inertial dampers compensated a fraction too late. The old knee flared with pain. My vision shook. The pilot fired thrusters hard. The cutter slewed sideways, trying to dodge the densest debris. Fragments the size of fingernails and fragments the size of helmets spun past the viewport. Some of them weren't metal. Some of them looked like pale fibrous matter, like dried seaweed turned to bone. The civilians froze in place, their camera lights still on, recording nothing but chaos. The comms board lit up with noise. Not voices, not a channel. A broad spectrum hiss that drowned the standard beacons and made the ship feel deaf. The pilot tried to cut through it with narrowband bursts. The noise adjusted. The hiss thickened. It wasn't a jammer in the normal sense. It felt like the universe itself had decided to speak over us. We didn't have time to analyze. The graveyard began to move. Objects that had been drifting in stable near misses altered their vectors by fractions. Tiny changes that the auto-predictor didn't catch fast enough. A stripped cargo frame rotated in a way that put its jagged edge on a collision path with a habitat hulk. A truss assembly drifted toward our cutter, like it had been nudged by a gentle hand. The pilot fired again, burning fuel we were supposed to keep for the return. The first official sign of attack came as a flashing line on my suit. HUD, remote beacon lost. Outpost signal, dead. The second sign came from the carrier, a pressure alarm. Not on the cutter. On the carrier, transmitted as a compressed emergency packet through the noise, the last clean thing that got through before the hiss swallowed it. Compartment 7C, rapid depress, orization. The carrier was supposed to be quiet. Mothballed systems, old analog control lines, deliberately isolated from networked security so nothing could climb in through a wire. It was a relic kept dumb on purpose. And it was bleeding air. We turned back. The return vector through the ring was worse than the approach. The debris field from the erased memorial station was spreading like a slow cloud. The ring's normal drift patterns had been disturbed, and the auto-predictor screamed warnings now. Too late, too many at once. The pilot had the fly-by-eye and instinct, making micro-burns, trusting the cutter's hull to survive the impacts. I strapped myself into the forward harness and watched the carrier grow in the viewport. It looked the same. That was the third sign that something was wrong. When a ship is bleeding air, you see it. You see frost plumes. You see glittering streams. You see the haze of vented moisture. The carrier showed none of it. We docked to the platform's collar under emergency protocol. The lock cycled slow, as if it didn't want to open. The hiss in the comms pressed against my eardrums even through the suit padding, a sensation more than a sound. It made the back of my teeth ache. Inside the platform's main tunnel, the lights were still on, but they flickered in a pattern that didn't match power fluctuations. It was too regular, a pulse. We moved through the pressurized corridor without speaking. Our helmet feeds showed each other's suit integrity, oxygen levels, pulse rates. I saw the civilian's heart rate spiking. I saw the pilot's steady line. I saw my own, flat and stubborn, the way it had been since the last time I pulled a friend out of a compartment and found only a mask full of ice. The first bodies were in the junction to 7C. 2 platform techs, civilian, their tools still in their hands. They were pressed into the corner near a maintenance hatch, their limbs bent in wrong angles that had nothing to do with impact. Their faces were gray-blue. Their eyes were open. Their cheeks had the tiny hemorrhages that came from trying to breathe against a closed airway. No blood, no blast, no obvious trauma, just suffocation. The hatch panel beside them was open, its bolts neatly removed. Inside the service duct, I saw pale growth. It looked like reef coral translated into metal, a branching lattice, porous and wet-looking, threaded with thin filaments that glimmered when my helmet light hit them. It had grown through the duct as if the duct was soil. It shouldn't have been possible, not in this cold, not in this dry. My suit's chemical sniffers spiked. Trace organics, trace lubricants, trace something like salt. I backed away and sealed the hatch with a manual clamp, crushing the growth under the gasket. It resisted, soft then suddenly rigid, like it had bones. I marked the area and moved on. Compartment 7C was a midship storage bay on the carrier side, connected to the platform by a pressurized work tunnel. The bay had once held munitions and spare parts. Now it held crates of stripped components waiting for processing. It should have been empty of people. The pressure door to 7C was open. That was not normal under any circumstance. In a decommissioning zone, doors stayed sealed unless a work order was active. Open doors meant oversight or sabotage or someone panicking. We approached slow. The air in the tunnel smelled wrong. Not smoke, not coolant, something faintly biological like wet stone. The suit HUD warned of oxygen fraction irregularities ahead. Not low oxygen, too high in one pulse, then too low, like the system was breathing. I reached the bay threshold and stopped. Inside 7C, the lights were out. Emergency strips glowed dim along the floor. The bay was filled with a fine mist of ice crystals that drifted in slow swirls. A partial depressurization had occurred, but not complete. Enough to chill everything, enough to make breath visible. The crates were open, not pried, just unlatched. Their contents, wiring bundles, conduit segments, sealed boxes, were scattered across the floor like someone had dumped them in a hurry. And in the center of the bay, something moved. It wasn't large. It was a ripple in the ice mist, a disturbance, like a fish turning in murky water. My helmet light caught a glimpse of branching lattice, the same pale reef growth threading itself through the spilled components. It was building. My training said, burn it. My orders said, secure the bay. My instincts said it was already in the walls. I deployed a micro-drone cluster through the bay door. 5 small discs, each with a camera, thermal, and acoustic sensor. They floated into the bay on cold gas puffs, their lights dimmed. Their feeds came into my visor. The reef growth wasn't just on the floor. It was in the ceiling vents. It was inside the crates, woven through circuit boards and battery packs. It had grown into shapes that mimicked cable harnesses. Some of it had curled around the bay's pressure sensors, hugging them like a hand on a throat. One drone drifted closer and its feed went white. Not static, not interference. White like overexposed light. Then the drone feed returned for a second and showed its own camera lens covered in the branching lattice, as if the growth had reached out and touched it. I pulled the drones back. 2 returned. 3 didn't. Behind me, in the platform tunnel, a civilian retched into his suit. The sound came through the suit vibration pickups, not as words, just wet vibration. His oxygen draw spiked. Panic response. I didn't look at him. Looking didn't help. I keyed the manual bay seal and began to close the pressure door. The door moved halfway and stopped. The reef growth had extended into the door track. It was blocking the seal with deliberate placement, like a wedge. I forced the door with the exosuit's shoulder servo. The old shoulder lagged, then pushed. The door crushed the growth with a crunch that transmitted through the metal as a dull vibration. It felt wrong, like breaking teeth. The door sealed. The bay was contained, for now. Containment is a word that makes officials comfortable. In my world, it meant you bought minutes. The carrier's internal alarms were now a constant pulse, transmitted in bursts through whatever part of the comms still worked. Multiple compartments, pressure irregularities, electrical shorts, life support fluctuations. The ship was being dismantled, and its own systems were turning against it in quiet, lethal ways. We moved deeper. The platform-to-carrier work tunnel connected to the carrier's main service spine, a long corridor that ran the length of the ship. The spine was cold, stripped, lit by emergency strips and our helmet lights. The walls were lined with access panels and old conduit. I could see where workers had cut sections out in the past weeks, leaving raw edges. That rawness was where the reef growth favored. It wasn't everywhere. Not yet. It appeared in patches like infection, a seam of pale lattice behind a panel, a bloom in a vent, a thin film across a sensor node. In one junction, I found a pressure regulator with its control housing opened. The internal mechanism was wrapped in filaments, the way roots wrap around a rock. The filaments pulsed faintly, not with electricity but with something like peristalsis, a slow contraction. The regulator was set to bleed oxygen into a dead-end compartment, a compartment that now held 6 people. They were platform workers who had fled there when alarms started. They had sealed the door. They had done the right thing. The reef growth had adjusted the regulator to flood the space with oxygen until it turned toxic, then starve it, then flood again, driving their bodies into confusion. Their faces showed it, the desperate gasps, the trembling, the bloodshot eyes. They were dead with their hands on the door controls, as if they had tried to open it in the last seconds and couldn't coordinate. I shut off the regulator manually and sealed the housing with a clamp. It felt like shutting off a faucet after the house is already flooded. The civilians with us stopped filming at some point. Their camera lights went dark. They moved like ghosts in pressurized suits, floating their hands against walls for stability. Their breathing stayed too fast. I stayed slow. Slow was survival. Fast made mistakes. Fast got you vented. We reached the carrier's command deck access shaft. The command deck was symbolic now. The ship had been pulled offline from fleet network, and most command systems were already stripped. But the old analog comms trunk ran through there, thick copper and optical bundles that had been installed before anyone trusted wireless. If anything on this ship could still send a coherent distress, it was up there. The shaft ladder was cold under my gloves. We climbed in silence. My knee clicked. My breath sounded loud. Halfway up, the ladder rung above me broke. It didn't snap like metal fatigue. It dissolved. The rung became a brittle powder of gray dust that drifted in the shaft, sparkling in my helmet light. I froze, one hand locked, the other gripping the side rail. Above me, the shaft walls showed the reef growth threaded through the ladder mount points. It had eaten the metal from the inside, leaving a honeycomb structure that looked intact until touched. It wasn't just growing, it was digesting. We backed down. The shaft was compromised. We took the alternate route through the service crawl, a tight horizontal run that forced us to move on elbows, suits scraping. In the crawl, I could feel the ship's vibration, not engine hum, a faint rhythmic tremor, like a distant heartbeat. In the crawl, my suit's comms hiss intensified, and for a moment the noise in my teeth became almost patterned, as if something was trying to impose a rhythm on our nervous systems. I focused on the scrape of my gloves and the pressure readouts. Procedure over sensation. We emerged into the command deck antechamber. The door was ajar. Frost rimed its edges. Air leaked in a thin thread. The antechamber pressure was low but stable, held by emergency baffles. Inside, the space smelled of old plastic and the faint, sharp tang of ozone. The bodies here were military. 2 salvage Marines from 2nd Detachment, their suits split at the neck rings, not torn, unlatched. The suit collars were open, as if someone had released them calmly. Their faces were frozen in surprise, eyes wide. Their helmet visors floated nearby like discarded shells. In the corner, a comms console was covered in reef growth. The lattice had spread over the buttons and ports, and thin filaments were inserted into every connector. It looked like a living thing learning to play an instrument. The console display was on. It showed a static emergency prompt, the kind you see when a system has lost its network and is waiting for a key. The reef growth didn't care about prompts. It cared about pathways. I approached with a plasma cutter in my right hand, weapon mode. The cutter's muzzle warmed, a faint orange glow. The reef growth reacted. It didn't lunge, it didn't lash, it withdrew, pulling filaments back into the console ports with a smooth motion, like an animal retreating into a burrow. The lattice across the buttons flattened. The display flickered. Then the comms noise in my suit spiked, and my visor briefly showed ghost overlays, old maps, old transponder codes, things that weren't in my suit memory. For half a second, I saw the graveyard plotted in perfect detail, every drifting hulk tagged. It wasn't my data. It felt like the ship was being used as a transmitter for something else, like the reef growth was pushing patterns through our systems to see what stuck. I cut power to the console by pulling the manual breaker. The breaker was warm under my glove, too warm. Heat where there shouldn't be heat. The lights dimmed. In the dim, the reef growth glimmered faintly, as if it produced its own low bioluminescence. My helmet light caught it and made it look wet. We needed a way out. The platform collar was behind us. The cutter was still docked. The graveyard was now a shifting field of hazards, and the hiss in comms suggested the wider orbit was compromised. But staying on the carrier was worse. The reef growth was learning, adapting, using our infrastructure as both habitat and weapon. I started triage without calling it that. 2 civilians were already unstable, their oxygen consumption too high. They would burn through their suit reserves before we reached the cutter if anything slowed us. One had a cracked visor seal from scraping in the crawl. Micro leak. It was taped, but tape is not engineering. Tape is denial with adhesive. I carried extra canisters, but not enough for everyone if the return took longer than planned. I marked who would live based on numbers, not worth, not innocence, numbers. We moved back through the crawl. The ship shifted again, a low tremor. The emergency strips flickered in a new pattern, faster. The heartbeat was accelerating. In the spine corridor, we found the first active kill. A platform medic had set up a casualty point in a junction, using med foam and thermal blankets. He had sealed a small compartment as an air reserve. It was the right move, a small refuge to stabilize people. It was also predictable. The refuge door was closed. The manual lock indicator showed green. Safe. The medic was dead outside it, his suit intact, his hands still on the lock wheel. He had suffocated. Not from lack of oxygen, from too much. The refuge compartment's pressure gauge showed high, too high. The door seal had been reinforced by reef growth, thick lattice filling the gasket channel. The compartment had become a pressure cooker. The medic had tried to open it and equalize. The lock wheel turned, but the seal didn't give. The compartment held pressure like a fist. Inside, through the small window, I could see faces. 4 people, pressed against the glass, eyes bulging, lips blue, hands flattened. They had died trying to breathe air that was too dense and too toxic. The reef growth had learned a simple truth: humans will run toward air. It used that. I didn't open the refuge. I couldn't. Even if I cut the seal, the pressure differential would blow the compartment into the corridor. It would turn bodies into projectiles. It would tear suits. I marked the location for later, a meaningless act, then kept moving. At the platform collar, the docking tunnel lights were out. Only our helmet beams cut through the darkness. The comms hiss was now layered with intermittent clicks, like something tapping on a microphone from far away. We reached the cutter airlock. The lock cycle began. The inner door closed. Pressure equalized. Halfway through, the cycle paused. A warning flashed. External pressure instability. The cutter was still docked, but the platform collar seals were fluctuating. Something was interfering with the lock sensors, or with the physical seals. I crawled to the lock's maintenance panel and opened it. Inside, the wiring harness was threaded with pale filaments. The reef growth had reached the collar. It moved slowly, but it moved through any pathway that existed. It didn't need high speed. It needed time and access. I cut the filaments with the plasma cutter in short, controlled bursts. The smell of scorched organics filled the lock. The filaments were coiled, leaving behind a residue like salt and ash. The cycle resumed. The outer door opened. Beyond it, the cutter interior was dim, emergency lighting on. The pilot was in the forward seat, helmet on, hands on controls. His pulse was steady but elevated. He had been waiting with the engines hot, burning fuel to keep systems warm, a thin line between readiness and waste. We filed in. One civilian stumbled, his boot catching on the threshold lip. He fell hard. His visor cracked fully, a spiderweb fracture. The suit pressure dropped. His oxygen fraction began to fall. I knelt, pulled a patch seal from my kit, and slapped it over the fracture. It held for a second, then the crack widened. The plastic gave way in a slow tear. He clawed at it with gloved fingers, making it worse. I had Medphone. Medphone doesn't fix vacuum exposure through the face. I could have given him my helmet. That would have killed me. It would have made me a second casualty and a burden. Salvage taught me that sacrifices that create additional bodies are not heroic. They are inefficient. I sealed his suit collar manually, locking his head in place, reducing the leak to a thin hiss. It bought him seconds, maybe a minute. His eyes were wide. He tried to breathe. The air turned into frost in front of his lips. He went still before the cutter cleared the collar. The pilot detached. The cutter backed away from the platform in short thruster bursts, careful not to collide with drifting debris. Outside, the graveyard had become a moving maze. Hulks drifted on altered vectors. The erased memorial station's fragments spread like a shrapnel cloud. In the distance, I saw the platform's observation gallery. The thick glass was dark, no lights, no movement. The carrier's silhouette behind it seemed to pulse faintly, as if something inside was alive. The comms hiss surged again, and the cutter's sensor display began to populate with false contacts, dozens of transponder pings, all matching old carrier IDs, old scrapper tags, old station codes. Ghosts. The reef growth was broadcasting identities like bait. The pilot ignored them and flew by direct visual, using the gas giant's curve as reference, staying in the shadow where the debris field was less dense. A shard of metal struck our hull with a loud clang that reverberated through the cutter's frame. The cabin lights flickered. The civilians, those still alive, tensed. I didn't. Flinching wastes oxygen. We cleared the densest ring band and entered the quieter orbit beyond. For a moment, it felt like leaving a burning building into cold night air. The cutter's interior stabilized. The comms hiss lessened. The pilot's hands loosened. Then the hiss returned, stronger than before, and the cutter's internal alarms lit. Life support loop error. I felt it before the readout changed, a subtle shift in airflow, a taste of metal in the suit feed. The cutter's oxygen mix began to oscillate the same way the carriers had, too rich, then too lean. My suit's internal system compensated, drawing from my personal reserve. The reef growth was in the cutter. It had threaded the docking collar. It had reached our lock. It had been cut, but not fully. It didn't need much. A few filaments in a vent, a patch in a regulator housing, enough to touch our air. I moved to the cutter's life support access panel and opened it with gloved fingers that felt too clumsy in the cramped space. Inside, the tubing was laced with pale strands. The strands pulsed faintly. The regulator housing was warm again, like something was metabolizing. I cut. I burned filaments. I clamped tubing. I bypassed filters. I forced the system into a crude manual steady flow. The cutter's oxygen stabilized for 10 seconds. Then another alarm. Engine bay heat spike. The pilot's console flickered. The cutter shuddered as if it had hit turbulence in vacuum, a physical impossibility that still happens when systems fight each other. I understood then, in the flat way understanding arrives when your body is too tired for fear. The reef growth didn't need to destroy ships with weapons. It needed to make our machines turn on us, make our procedures into traps, make our own breathing into a variable it controlled. We were not fleeing an enemy. We were carrying it. The pilot initiated emergency purge of the life support lines. The purge valves opened. Air hissed out into space in a controlled vent, precious oxygen thrown away to clear contamination. The cabin pressure dipped, then recovered from reserve tanks. The civilians gasped, reflexively increasing their oxygen draw. The hiss in comms formed into something almost like a tone, not a voice, a sustained note that vibrated through the cutter's frame. I crawled into the engine bay access crawl, a narrow tube along the cutter's belly, and opened the panel. Inside, the engine's thermal shielding was coated with pale lattice. It was thin here, not a full bloom. It had spread along the heat lines, using warmth to grow faster. Filaments bridged between control cables and fuel lines like veins. In the engine bay, the wreath growth looked less like coral and more like an organ. I burned it with the plasma cutter until the bay filled with smoke that the purge system struggled to clear. The filaments shrank and curled, leaving char. The lattice cracked. The smell was like burned hair and scorched metal. The heat spike dropped. My suit's oxygen reserve dropped too. Burning in a confined space eats air. Procedure has a cost. When I crawled back into the cabin, the pilot's hands were shaking slightly. He wasn't panicking. He was exhausted. The remaining civilians were quiet now, either from shock or from conserving breath. Outside, the gas giant's shadow swallowed us, turning the viewport into a dark mirror. In that mirror, I saw my own helmet reflection, the frost at the seal edges, the tape patches, the line of my jaw scar. In the dark, the comms hiss faded, not because it ended, because we moved beyond its strongest range. We were alone in orbit with a damaged cutter, contaminated life support, depleted oxygen, and no reliable way to call for rescue. That is what the first hour of a war relapse looked like. Not banners, not speeches, not fleets. A small craft limping away from a graveyard, carrying survivors who didn't know if they were already dead. The cutter's nav system still had a plotted route back to the inner stations, where the fleet's administrative hub sat in relative safety. Relative safety is a phrase people use right before it becomes a lie. We couldn't broadcast. We couldn't receive. We could only fly. I began recording. Not a message, not a plea. An after-action memory dump spoken into my suit recorder, tagged with timestamps and sensor logs. If the cutter died and drifted, someone might find it. Someone might pull the recorder from my suit and hear what happened. I didn't speak names. Names don't survive in war. I spoke functions, events, observations. I described the erased memorial station, the clean cut, the reef growth in 7C, the suffocation traps, the oxygen oscillations, the contamination vectors. I described the feeling of the comms hiss in my teeth, because that mattered more than it should have. It felt like proximity, like being washed without eyes. Hours later, when the cutter's oxygen reserves dropped low enough that the cabin air tasted stale, we saw the first sign that we weren't the only ones moving. Ahead, in the gas giant's thin reflected glow, a ship drifted. A cargo frame, large, not military, its hull lit by our headlamps as we approached. It looked intact. Its transponder was silent. Its attitude thrusters were dead. It rotated slowly, exposing a side scarred by micrometeoroid impacts. It should have been another piece of junk. But the rotation was too smooth, too controlled. The pilot tried to avoid it. The cutter's thrusters fired. The cargo frame adjusted. Not a burn, not a jet, just a shift, a subtle alteration in rotation that brought it onto our path again. The reef growth wasn't only inside our ships. It was in the graveyard, in the debris, in anything that had pathways and time. The cargo frame drifted close enough that I saw the pale lattice on its surface, blooming around seams and hatches like frost that grew from within. The pilot fired thrusters harder. The cutter lurched. The cabin groaned. A civilian whimpered, a small involuntary sound. We scraped past the cargo frame with a margin of meters. The frame's jagged edge passed our viewport like a blade. Filaments on its surface brushed our hull, leaving faint streaks. I watched the streaks and felt nothing but tired certainty. We were still in the kill zone. The range was larger than we thought. The enemy's patience was longer than ours. The cutter's oxygen dipped again. The life support oscillated once more. I opened the access panel and found new filaments, thinner than before, already threading into the tubing. It had survived the purge. I burned them again. I clamped again. I felt the futility like a weight on my chest, not emotional, just physical. Every action cost oxygen, time, energy. The reef growth seemed to spend nothing. In the final stretch, when the cutter's reserves were low enough that our suit HUDs began to warn of impending hypoxia, the inner station lights appeared. A cluster of dots against black, stable, bright, comforting in a primitive way. The pilot aimed for them, adjusting vector for docking approach. I didn't feel relief. Relief is for people who believe in endings. As we closed, the station's normal beacon was absent. Its transponder didn't answer. Its docking lights were off. Only the station's hull lights remained, a cold outline in space. We approached on manual, slow, cautious, like you approach a door you suspect is booby-trapped. The station's outer ring showed damage, scorch marks, missing panels, a torn antenna array. No debris cloud. The damage looked old by hours, not minutes. The pilot slowed further. Then our comms hiss returned, stronger than it had been in open orbit, as if the station itself was broadcasting it. The station wasn't silent because it was dead. It was silent because it was speaking in a language that drowned ours. The cutter's docking collar aligned with the station's port. The collar pedals opened. The station's port pedals opened in response. Obedient, smooth, ritual. I thought of the memorial station's collar opening before it vanished. I thought of how clean that cut had been. I made the decision without saying it. I moved to the cutter's airlock and began sealing it permanently from the inside, overriding the pilot's docking cycle. The pilot looked back once, his visor turning. No words, just a question in posture. I finished sealing. I set the lock to manual dead. I cut the internal cycle link. I isolated the lock controls. Then I opened the maintenance vent behind the airlock panel and found the reef growth again, thin filaments already reaching toward the docking collar. I burned them. I burned until the panel was charred and my suit oxygen was down to the last warning threshold. I keyed my recorder again and appended the final note. Approach to inner station, station compromised, comms hijacked, docking unsafe, contamination persistent. I didn't say what would happen next. Predictions are a luxury. The pilot pulled away from the station port at the last moment, thrusters flaring. The station's port pedals remained open, empty, waiting. We drifted in its shadow, not docking, not rescued, not dead yet. My suit oxygen warning became a constant pulse. My breath sounded too loud. In the viewport, ice crystals floated from a small vent leak, glittering in the station's reflected light. They moved slow, like snowfall in a place that never had weather. That was the last image that stayed clean in my mind. Everything after that blurred into procedure, rationing breaths, sealing compartments, burning filaments, watching the lights of a dead station that still held shape like a mask. Somewhere behind us, in the graveyard, the carrier's silhouette would still be hanging in the ring, full of pale lattice, patiently digesting metal and learning new pathways. And somewhere in the noise that drowned our comms, the reef mind would be counting our reflexes, turning them into tools. I kept recording until my tongue felt thick and my hands moved slower. When my suit finally forced the last oxygen conservation mode, the world narrowed to numbers and frost and the steady, indifferent light of a station that had already been taken. I did not feel heroic. I felt used, and I stayed awake long enough to remember that in war, the first thing you lose is the belief that anything is symbolic. The second thing you lose is air. The conservation mode made everything honest. My suit stopped smoothing my breathing. It stopped hiding how fast the oxygen reserve was draining. It dimmed the visor display down to essentials: pressure, oxygen fraction, carbon dioxide, scrub status, heart rate, suit seal integrity, and a single flashing timer that counted down to a number nobody could negotiate with. I had seen that timer in other places, in breach drills, in training accidents, in real compartments where someone's mask had failed and the air had turned into a ration. The cabin of the cutter was quiet except for the pilot's controls and the faint, irregular thumps of the life support pump cycling in a pattern that was no longer purely mechanical. It felt wrong, the way a heartbeat feels wrong when it skips. We drifted in the interstation shadow because shadow meant less debris, less stray radiation, less sensor glare. Shadow also meant we were harder to see if anything was looking. That was what the pilot believed. I didn't correct him. Corrections require confidence. The station's hull lights remained on. They outlined its ring structure like a skeleton traced in cold ink. No docking traffic, no signal flares, no emergency strobes, nothing that said human hands were still doing human things. We made one cautious pass at standoff distance, using optics and passive sensors. The cutter's boards were blind in places where the comms hiss thickened, but optics didn't care about jamming. Light is honest until something blocks it. The station had breach scars on 3 sectors. One looked like an impact crater. 2 looked like something had opened the hull from inside and pushed outward. The torn metal petals had curled back like peeled skin. I saw movement along one of the breach edges. Not a person, not a drone. A slow flow of pale lattice, creeping along exposed structural ribs, filling the wound. It grew like frost, but with purpose. It didn't spread evenly. It followed lines. It chose pathways. The reef growth looked different out here, not confined by ducts and panels. In open vacuum, it had a denser, more compact form. The branching structures were thicker, the filaments braided into cords. It clung to the station with anchor nodes that punched into metal like roots splitting stone. It was building itself into the station. The pilot kept the cutter steady. His hands were tight on the controls. His pulse line on my visor was high and steady, not panic. Sustained stress. Behind us, the remaining civilians were slumped in their harnesses. Their oxygen consumption had fallen now, either from discipline or fatigue. One had a gray tint visible through his visor, lips pale. I watched his seal key indicator climb slowly as his scrubber struggled. The cheap civilian units weren't built for long-duration combat stress. We were in a situation where nothing was designed for the duration. We had 2 options: dock and risk bringing the contamination into the cutter fully, or stay outside and run out of oxygen. A third option existed in my head, unspoken, because the human mind always produces a third option when the first 2 are death. The third option was to separate. The cutter had a service pod, a small pressurized blister meant for maintenance EVA staging. It could detach in an emergency. It held minimal reserves, minimal systems, no real propulsion beyond cold gas. It was not meant to be a lifeboat, It was meant to be an accessory. Accessories become lifeboats when people are desperate enough. I crawled forward to the pilot without speaking. In the narrow cabin, movement felt like moving through thick liquid. The fatigue made everything heavy. I tapped the console edge twice, a simple gesture to get his attention. He turned his helmet toward me. I pointed at the station, then at the service pod indicator, then made a small slicing motion across my throat. Not melodrama, just clarity. He stared for a beat, then nodded once. He understood. Docking the cutter was too dangerous, but a smaller pod with fewer pathways could dock, bring back supplies, maybe survivors, maybe a comms patch, maybe anything. If it got infected, we could cut it loose and keep the cutter cleaner. Cleaner, not safe. We prepped the pod. Preparation in low oxygen is different. Every movement is weighed against breaths. Every tool choice is a calculation. I stripped my kit down to essentials: plasma cutter, 1 breaching charge, 2 oxygen canisters, med foam, a manual seal clamp, a handful of patch plates, and the ECM puck that could still throw a narrow burst interference cone if the reef mine was using a specific band. I checked my suit seals again. The tape patches were still holding. The collar ring leak was minimal. Minimal was a lie you tell yourself when the timer is visible. The pilot rerouted what remained of the cutter's clean oxygen to fill the pod's reservoir. It was a controlled theft. The cutter's survival time shortened so the pod could have minutes longer. Minutes were currency now. One civilian, the one with the gray lips, tried to stand. His knees buckled. He hit the harness frame hard, a dull thud. I looked at him and did not feel compassion in the way people imagine it. Compassion requires energy. I felt only the recognition of a failing system. He would not survive a pod sortie. His scrubber was already losing. The pilot and I moved him to the rear, secured him, and tightened his mask seal. It was maintenance, not care. We kept the machine running as long as possible. Then I entered the service pod. The pod was cramped, barely room to kneel. Its air smelled of rubber and old disinfectant. The hatch sealed behind me with a hiss. I watched the pressure equalize. I watched the oxygen fraction stabilize. The timer in my visor ticked down. The pilot detached the pod. There was a gentle jolt. The pod drifted free, tethered by a thin umbilical line for data and emergency gas. The pilot cut the umbilical. We were fully separate. I was alone in a small bubble of air, facing a station that had already been taken. The comms hiss inside the pod was quieter, reduced by distance and reduced by fewer systems to hijack. My suit still tasted it in my teeth, but it was less. I fired cold gas thrusters, inching toward the station docking port. The port was open, its petals were spread. It looked like a mouth. As I approached, I could see the inner surface of the port ring. Pale lattice lined the gasket channel. Thin filaments waved in the vacuum like hair in water, moving with microcurrents from the pod's thrusters. It was waiting. I adjusted vector to approach slightly off-center, aiming to dock not with full mechanical engagement, but with a partial seal that could be forced and then overridden manually. That was the salvage way. Never trust automation. The pod's docking nose made contact. The port ring flexed. The pod jolted softly. The seal began to form. My visor showed pressure change in the collar space. It held, imperfect but stable. I cycled the pod hatch manually, not opening into the station fully, just cracking it enough to insert a seal clamp into the gap. A trick used in damaged airlocks: create a temporary gasket, then reinforce. When the hatch cracked, air hissed. Not just pod air, but station air leaking outward. The station still had pressure, not full, but enough. That meant something inside was maintaining life support, or something inside was using it. I forced the clamp into place and tightened. The seal improved. The hiss lessened. Then I widened the hatch. The station air was cold and stale. It carried the faint tang of ozone and something organic, like wet stone. The emergency lights inside were dim but functional. The corridor beyond the hatch was narrow, lined with maintenance panels. I entered. The station's gravity was negligible. I pushed off, moved slowly, using handholds. My helmet light cut through the dim. The corridor walls were coated in a thin film of frost. In places, the frost wasn't frost. It was pale lattice, woven so fine it looked like ice until my light angled and revealed the branching structure. The reef growth was everywhere here. It had time. My suit sensors showed oxygen fraction in the station, air fluctuating, the same oscillation pattern. It was not stable life support. It was manipulated. I stayed in my suit. I did not trust the station air. I moved toward the station's central hub, where the comms array control room would be. If anything could broadcast a coherent distress, it would be there. If there were survivors, they would likely be near the hub or in sealed refuge compartments. The station was quiet, not peaceful. Quiet like a body after the last convulsion. I passed a junction where a pressure door hung half open. Beyond it, a compartment full of chairs and wall screens, an administrative room, maybe once used to host the yearly ritual logs. The chairs were bolted to the floor. The screens were cracked. The walls were stained with a dark film that looked like smoke residue. On the floor, two bodies in civilian suits lay curled. Their helmet visors were intact, their suits were intact, their hands were pressed to their throats. The suit telemetry ports on their wrists had been pried open. The reef growth had threaded into the ports, inserting filaments into the suit's life support interface, turning their own scrubbers into weapons. Their oxygen lines had been forced into oscillation until their bodies failed. I didn't stop. Stopping was a luxury. I noted it. I moved on. In the hub corridor, I found the first sign of active presence. A drone. Human-made, small, the kind used for station maintenance. It hovered in place, lights off, its camera lens pointed at me. Its propulsors made no sound in vacuum. It was held steady by microthrusters. It should have broadcast an ID ping. It did not. Instead, my suit comms spiked and formed a brief, sharp pattern. My visor flickered. For a heartbeat, my suit HUD tried to overlay the drone as friendly maintenance unit. The tag was wrong. It was not my database. The reef mind was trying to label reality for me. I raised my real carbine and fired one controlled burst. The rounds punched through the drone's casing. In vacuum, there was no bang, just the recoil through my suit and the sudden spray of fragments. The drone spun away, leaking a faint mist of lubricant that froze into glitter. As it drifted, pale filaments extended from its broken frame, twitching in the void like severed nerves. It had been used. It had been grown into. I moved into the comms control room. The room was larger than the corridors, a circular space with consoles arranged in a ring around a central mast feed. The consoles were old. The station had been built as a symbol, not as a cutting-edge node. The room was lit by emergency strips. The main overhead lights were off. The air was colder here, as if the station's thermal regulation had failed. The consoles were coated in reef growth. Not fully buried, but threaded. Filaments inserted into ports, lattice spread across keys, anchor nodes punched into panel seams. It looked like the carrier comms console, but worse. Mature. Integrated. In the center of the room, a body sat in a chair. Military. A fleet officer, judging by the suit pattern and the rank patch on the shoulder. The helmet was off. His head was tilted forward. His hands were resting on the console as if he had been typing. His fingers were fused to the keys by pale lattice. The reef growth had grown through his gloves, into his skin, using him as a substrate. His face was gray, lips parted. His eyes were open, unfocused. He had been dead for hours, maybe longer. His suit telemetry port was open, filaments threaded into it like veins. I didn't touch him. Touching is a pathway. I looked for a manual comms breaker, a way to cut the station's broadcast and replace it with a narrow distress, a way to at least send one burst to the cutter, one clean packet, before the reef mind adjusted. I found the breaker panel. It was warm. Heat, again, where there shouldn't be heat. Warmth meant metabolic activity. The reef growth was using electrical load. It was consuming power and producing heat as waste, like a living machine. I opened the panel. Inside, the wiring harness was braided with pale cords, not just threading, full integration. The cords had nodes that pulsed faintly. It was not a parasite now. It was the nervous system. I cut one cord with the plasma cutter. The moment the cord burned through, my suit comms hiss screamed, and my visor filled with white for half a second. A pressure alarm sounded in my helmet, not from my suit, but from the room, a sudden venting as a panel somewhere opened. The station reacted as if wounded. The reef mind had feedback loops. Cutting it triggered physical responses. I cut another cord. The room's emergency lights flickered. The central mass feed hummed, a vibration I felt through my boots. I realized then that I was not going to turn off the station's broadcast. The reef mind was the broadcast. The station was now a transmitter for its presence, and my attempts to cut it were like cutting nerves. Painful, reactive, unpredictable. I needed a smaller goal. Supplies. If the station still had oxygen canisters, suit parts, anything, I could bring them back to the cutter. I could extend our survival time. Survival time was the only currency that mattered. I searched the storage lockers. Most were open, emptied. Some were sealed. The sealed ones had reef growth around their edges like wax on a jar. It didn't want them opened. That meant there was something inside worth protecting. I placed a breaching charge on the first sealed locker, a small-shaped charge designed for controlled entry. I set it on minimal yield. I moved back, braced, detonated. The locker door blew inward with a soft thump, metal folding. Inside, oxygen canisters. 4 of them, sealed, standard military issue. I grabbed them, tethered them to my harness, and moved to the pod hatch. As I moved, the station corridor lights pulsed. The heartbeat pattern again, faster. The comms hiss in my teeth intensified. My visor flickered with ghost overlays, docking instructions, friendly tags, a false sense of routine. The reef mind was trying to make me move predictably. I forced myself to slow down. Slow is unpredictability when the enemy expects haste. At the pod hatch, I cycled the seal clamp loose and began transferring the canisters into the pod. One canister slipped. It bumped the hatch frame and spun slowly in 0G. As it spun, I saw a thin, pale filament on its valve. A single strand. It had already touched the canisters. It had already seeded them. I froze, canister in hand, staring at that filament. This was the reef mind's real weapon, not violence, not explosions, but contamination of logistics. It didn't need to chase fleets. It needed to ride the supply chain, ride the rescue routines, ride the human instinct to bring air home. I could bring the canisters back and extend our survival, but I might also bring the infection into the cutter fully. I could leave them and die sooner. There was no clean choice, only timescales. I burned a filament off the canister valve with a brief plasma flick. The valve hissed slightly, pressure release minimal. The canister remained sealed. I inspected the others. 2 had filaments. 2 did not, at least visibly. Visible is not the same as absent. I made the decision based on procedure. Treat all as contaminated unless proven otherwise. But proof required lab tools we didn't have. I brought only the 2 that looked clean. I left 2 behind. Leaving oxygen behind is not something a sane person does. But sanity doesn't survive war. Procedure does. I sealed the pod hatch and detached. As the pod pulled away from the station port, the station's docking pedals began to close. Not automatically, deliberately. smoothly. It felt like a mouth deciding it had tasted enough. The pod drifted back toward the cutter on cold gas. The cutter was a dark shape in the station's shadow, hull lights dimmed, trying to be small. As I approached, the cutter's airlock remained sealed, the pilot waiting for my return signal. I did not send it through comms. I flashed my suit light in a coded pattern to the viewport, 2 long, 1 short. Contaminated environment. Caution. The pilot responded with 1 long flash. Acknowledged. We docked the pod to the cutter's service collar, not the main collar. The pilot kept the main airlock isolated. We were already treating our own ship like a quarantine zone. I cycled into the cutter through the service interface, moving canisters carefully, sealing them in a containment bag, then sealing that bag in the small cargo locker near the rear. Double barrier, not trust, delay. The gray-lipped civilian was dead when I returned. His visor was fogged with frost. His hands were relaxed at his sides. His oxygen consumption had dropped to 0. 1 less mouth, 1 less scrubber, 1 less variable. No one reacted. There was no energy for grief. The pilot listened to my gestures and the short data burst I sent through a hard line, not comms, station compromised, mature reef integration, drones hostile, supplies contaminated, 2 canisters acquired with low visible contamination, docking unsafe. He nodded once. Then he turned the cutter away from the station and fired thrusters. We left the inner station behind, not because it was lost, because we could not afford to be close to it. We moved into deeper shadow, using the gas giant as cover, plotting a slow trajectory toward the outer emergency depots. Old caches placed in orbit for disasters that officials believed were theoretical. The comms hiss followed us, weaker now but present, like tinnitus after an explosion. Hours passed in dim cabin light. Oxygen reserves dwindled. We rotated soup reserves, sharing canisters in controlled amounts. The pilot and I kept our masks sealed tight. The civilians had no discipline for that. They breathed as if air was still a background feature of the universe. One by one, they went quiet. Not dramatic, not choking. Their scrubbers failed. Their carbon dioxide climbed. Their brains slowed. They fell asleep and did not wake. Their heart lines flattened. Death in low oxygen is often quiet. That is part of its cruelty. It doesn't announce itself with violence. It simply stops the machine. By the time we reached the first emergency depot, only 3 of us remained: the pilot, me, and 1 civilian who had stayed calm enough to conserve breath. He was young. He had the blank stare of someone who had never imagined this kind of quiet end. The depot was a small automated cache bolted to a piece of old truss, hidden in the gas giant's far orbit. It had been placed there decades ago. Its transponder was supposed to be silent unless pinged by authorized codes. We pinged it with an old analog burst, not through comms, but through a tight beam optical flash. The depot responded. Its docking port opened. Relief tried to rise in my chest. I killed it before it formed. We approached slow. Optics showed the depot hull intact, no obvious reef growth blooms. But that meant little. The reef mind had learned to hide in seams. We docked with the pod first. Same procedure. Always the pod. The pod collar sealed. The depot port held pressure. That was promising. I entered alone again, because that was what I was now. The part of the system that touched contaminated spaces so others could stay cleaner. Inside the depot, the air was stale but stable. The emergency strips were on. The supply lockers were sealed, their surfaces coated in dust. No pale lattice visible. I opened the first locker. Inside, oxygen canisters, sealed with tamper indicators intact. Food packs, medical kits, a portable comms beacon in a hard case, the kind designed to broadcast distress on multiple bands, with encryption keys for fleet channels. A piece of the old world, still in plastic. I inspected the canister valves. No filaments visible. I inspected the locker seams. No lattice. For the first time in hours, something looked uninfected. That did not mean it was safe. It meant the reef mind had not reached here yet, or had not needed to. I tethered 4 oxygen canisters and the comms beacon, moved them toward the pod hatch. As I did, the depot lights flickered. Once, twice, then steadied. My suit comms hiss sharpened, forming a brief tone. The depot was being touched. Not physically, not yet, but the reef mine's signal was reaching. The question was distance, range, how far the kill zone extended. I didn't wait to find out. I shoved the canisters through the pod hatch and sealed it. I grabbed the comms beacon and sealed it in its hard case, then sealed that case in my suit's external cargo pouch. As I moved back toward the depot hatch, I saw something in the corridor corner. A thin, pale filament, no thicker than a hair, emerging from a vent seam. It hadn't been there minutes ago. It was here now. The reef mind was not only a signal, it was a presence that could arrive in silence through debris, through microfragments, through any contact. We had docked, we had connected, we had provided a pathway. I closed the depot hatch behind me and blew the pod's separation bolts. The pod detached with a jolt. The depot remained behind, its port pedals still open, as if surprised. In the cutter, the pilot watched my light code and executed without hesitation. He detached the pod from the cutter and reeled it in through the service collar, keeping the main airlock isolated. We moved the new canisters into containment. We moved the comms beacon into the forward bay, away from life support lines. Then the pilot powered the beacon. For a moment, the cabin filled with the soft hum of its startup sequence. A clean sound, a sound of intention. The beacon began broadcasting. Immediately, the comms hiss returned full force, smashing into the cabin like a wave. The beacon's status lights flickered. Its display scrambled. The encryption handshake failed. The broadcast shifted bands automatically. The hiss shifted with it. The reef mind was listening. It wasn't just jamming, it was following, adapting in real time. It didn't care what we said, it cared that we were trying to connect. The pilot shut the beacon off. Silence returned, relative. We stared at the dark display, breathing slow. The civilian looked at me through his visor. His eyes were wide, asking the question nobody wanted to ask. How far did this go? I had no answer, so I gave the only thing I could. Procedure. We would not broadcast. We would not dock to manned stations. We would not follow standard rescue protocols. We would drift toward the outer systems where traffic was low, where there were fewer pathways. We would ration oxygen and hope to find a ship that was still clean, still blind to ritual. Hope is not allowed in my job description. But planning sometimes looks like hope from the outside. The pilot plotted a course into deep orbit, using only passive nav and old star charts. He turned off non-essential systems to reduce pathways for infection. The cutter became colder. The cabin lights dimmed. We moved like ghosts. Days passed, or hours, time blurred in the dim. The reef growth inside the cutter did not stop trying. Filaments reappeared in life support panels. We burned them. We clamped lines. We purged. Every purge cost oxygen. Every burn cost oxygen. We were trading future minutes for present stability. The civilian died on the second day. He had conserved well, but his suit scrubber failed in the end, a cheap unit not designed for prolonged stress. He fell asleep and didn't wake, his heart line flattened. I recorded his death as a data point, not because he didn't matter, but because that was the only way I could carry it. As numbers, as procedure. Now it was only the pilot and me. 2 humans in a contaminated cutter drifting through cold space, refusing to call for help because help was a pathway. At some point, the pilot's hands began to tremble more. Not fear, hypoxia, microsleep, exhaustion. I took the forward seat in rotations, using the suit's microstims sparingly. Stims don't create oxygen. They just make you spend it with clearer eyes. We saw ships sometimes, distant lights in the void. We did not approach. We watched them pass like stars. We did not know if they were real ships or reef mine bait using ghost transponders. Trust was gone. On the fourth day, the cutter's main oxygen reserve hit the last threshold. The suit timers became red. The pilot's visor showed the same. We had 2 clean canisters left, maybe. Clean was a guess. We had one decision left that mattered. Who would use the last oxygen? I looked at the pilot's telemetry and my own. His heart rate was higher, his tremor worse. My suit's seal integrity was lower because of the tape patches. I would leak more over time. He was the better machine at this point. I handed him the last canister. He looked at it, then at me. No words, no protest, just a long, steady look through visors. He took it and secured it. I recorded that too. Not as sacrifice, as triage. When my suit timer hit the final minutes, I moved to the rear compartment, strapped myself in, and sealed my suit into the most conservative mode. Minimal movement, minimal breathing, minimal heat. The cutter drifted in darkness, systems dimmed, a cold capsule moving away from the infected orbit. The comms hiss was faint now, a distant tinnitus. Whether that meant distance or deception, I didn't know. I watched ice crystals float in the cabin, tiny flecks from our breath that froze and drifted like slow snow. The last thing my mind held on to was that image. Particles suspended in a place where gravity had no opinion, glittering in helmet light. I kept recording until my tongue stopped forming clean shapes and the timer became an abstract number. In the end, I didn't think about war. I didn't think about symbols. I didn't think about the memorial station or the carrier or the reef growth. I thought about seals. I thought about clamps. I thought about how every system can be turned against the people who rely on it, given enough time and enough pathways. The cutter's lights dimmed further as power-saving modes engaged. The pilot's breathing in the forward compartment was a faint vibration through the hull. Steady. Still alive. My own breathing slowed. The ice crystals kept drifting. They looked like snow. They looked like debris. They looked the same, depending on what you wanted to believe. The end. There's nothing more to process. No signals, no alerts, no follow-ups. Just quiet, steady rest.